Welcome to the debate. When you watch a total solar eclipse, there is this singular, highly dramatic moment of totality. The sun, the moon, and the earth, they all perfectly align in just one cosmic instant.
Right. It's a profound visual.
It really is. And to the naked eye, just standing there in the sudden dark, it looks and feels like a single unified event.
It totally feels simultaneous. But, astrophysicists know it is actually a strict sequence. The moon's shadow hits the Earth, travels across the surface, and, well, what we perceive as a sudden, simultaneous alignment is really a precise, unfolding progression of distinct celestial movements.
Exactly. It looks simultaneous, but the math tells us a sequential story. Today, we're taking that exact idea, the tension between things happening all at once versus things happening in a strict sequence, and applying it to one of the most famous and frankly complex puzzles in biblical prophecy.
And I know we are diving right into the deep end here today.
We really are. We are looking at the chronological placement of what is known as the Abomination of Desolation.
Yeah, for listeners who might be familiar with end times theology or eschatology, there is a widely discussed 7-year period of ultimate global crisis, often called the tribulation. But what we are really zooming in on today is the exact machinery of how that period ends.
Precisely. We are asking a highly specific question based on the prophetic texts of Daniel and Revelation. Is the setting up of the Abomination of Desolation definitively a midpoint event?
Meaning, does it happen exactly at the 3.5-year mark?
Right. Does it happen at the exact middle of that 7-year period, or does a strict reading of Daniel's day counts demand a delayed fulfillment?
Which, and I think we both agree on this, completely shifts how we understand the climax of the narrative.
It absolutely does. I'll be defending the traditional midpoint dispensational view. My position is that the cessation of daily sacrifices in the Jewish temple and the ultimate desecration of that temple, the abomination itself, are simultaneous events.
Okay.
They pivot the tribulation at the exact 3.5-year mark, serving as a single hinge on which the rest of history turns.
And I will be defending what is called the sequential nested 1290 model. I am arguing that Daniel chapter 12 mathematically and narratively demands that the abomination of desolation be delayed.
So not a midpoint event.
Right, not necessarily a midpoint event. Instead, it happens 30 days later at day 1290. And I believe this distinction is crucial because it separates the Antichrist or the beast's sanctioned political reign from his final, desperate act of theological rebellion.
Okay, so to set the baseline here for everyone, the traditional midpoint view offers a highly cohesive structural framework. It's rooted heavily in the book of Daniel, specifically Daniel 9:27 and 11:31, as well as clear historical precedent.
Yeah, the historical prototypes are important here.
Exactly. The prophecy outlines a future ruler who will confirm a 7-year covenant or treaty with Israel. But, as the text explicitly says, in the middle of the week, meaning the middle of that 7-year period, he will abolish the daily sacrifice and set up an idolatrous image.
And you anchor that heavily in what happened in the 2nd century BC, right?
I do. For those who might not be familiar with the history, let's look back at 1670 BC. There was a Greek king named Antiochus Epiphanes who literally marched into the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, forcefully stopped their daily sacrifices, and then
He slaughtered a pig, right?
he slaughtered a pig on an altar to the Greek god Zeus. That historical event is what scholars call a prototype, a historical preview of what this future abomination of desolation will look like.
It's the model.
Right. And Antiochus didn't wait. He didn't stop the sacrifices, take a month off, and then bring in the idol. The stoppage of proper worship and the institution of false worship were the exact same hinge event.
They happened together in history.
Yes. And I argue that this exact historical pattern is what Jesus Christ warned of in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. Furthermore, it perfectly aligns with the beast's 42-month or 1,260-day reign of terror that is vividly outlined in Revelation 13.
Right, the 42 months.
When you synthesize all these texts, the most elegant, seamless reading is that the abomination of desolation marks the exact middle of the 7 years. That desecration is the catalyst that makes the entire second half of the tribulation, all 42 months of it, the Great Tribulation.
Well, I come at it from a different way. I mean, the midpoint view is elegant, yes, and it paints a very clean structural picture. But I believe it suffers from what we call exegetical compression.
Exegetical compression.
Yeah, it forces multiple distinct textual events into a single moment unnecessarily. And I think that's largely because we are so conditioned by tradition to look for a clean, perfectly symmetrical midpoint.
So how does the sequential model lay out the timeline differently? Because I know we are throwing a lot of numbers out here today. 1260, 1290, 1335. But bear with us, because these aren't just arbitrary digits. They represent an actual countdown in the text.
That's exactly right. The sequential nested 1290 model takes Daniel's numerical markers with absolute chronological seriousness. In this framework, we have a sequential timeline. The 7 years are divided into two 1260-day periods.
Okay, tracking with you.
The second 1260 days is the beast's divinely sanctioned 42-month reign. Now, I agree with you that the sacrifices do stop at the beginning of the second period. However, the abomination of desolation does not happen at that midpoint.
You're saying the clock starts, but the idol isn't set up yet?
Exactly. Instead, at day 1260, which corresponds to the seventh trumpet in Revelation, the beast's legal, sanctioned authority from God actually ends.
Okay.
This triggers a 30-day interim period of dismantling from day 1260 to day 1290. It culminates in the beast's desperate final act of defiance, the abomination of desolation on day 1290. And it is this specific, delayed act that launches a highly concentrated literal 45-day Great Tribulation from day 1290 to day 1335.
So the fundamental wedge between our positions is whether the abomination of desolation must be a midpoint event, or if the text actually forces us to decouple it and delay it. Let's start right at the text that drives your chronology, Daniel 12:11.
Yes, absolutely. Daniel 12:11 is the decisive text for the sequential model. It says, and I quote, "From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days."
Right?
The text explicitly lists two distinct actions. First, the regular sacrifice is abolished. Second, the abomination of desolation is set up. The traditional midpoint model collapses these into a single moment, but grammatically this dual formulation is completely redundant if they are the exact same event.
You think it's redundant.
I do. Instead, the verse is using the cessation of sacrifices as the starting marker for a 1290-day count, and the climax of that count is the abomination of desolation. It is a sequence, not simultaneity.
Well, I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are divorcing Daniel 12 entirely from Daniel 9:27.
How so?
Well, Daniel 9 explicitly ties both the stopping of the sacrifice and the abominations directly to the middle of the week.
But how do you reconcile the distinct grammar of the two actions in chapter 12?
Let me offer an analogy to explain how these can be distinct actions on paper, but the exact same chronological event in reality. Think of it like a corporate hostile takeover.
Okay.
The acquiring CEO signs the final acquisition paperwork and then immediately fires the old management team. Business historians might record the signing of the acquisition and the termination of the old board as two distinct actions with different verbs.
Sure.
But chronologically and functionally, they are the exact same hinge event in the life of the company. Why separate what history, the Antiochus prototype and Daniel 9 all join together?
The cessation of proper worship creates a spiritual vacuum that is instantaneously filled by the abomination.
That is a compelling argument, but, well, have you considered how your hostile takeover analogy actually proves my point when we apply it to the specific physical geography of Revelation 11?
What do you mean? You talk about the CEO walking in and taking over the building. Let's look at what actually happens in the capital city, Jerusalem, during those 42 months.
Revelation 11.1-2 creates a massive textual conflict for the midpoint view.
In what ways?
In Revelation 11, the Apostle John is handed a measuring rod. He is told to physically measure the temple of God, but explicitly told to leave the outer court and the rest of the city out of his measurements.
Right. Measure the temple, leave the court.
To be trampled for 42 months. This is a deliberate, highly specific distinction. The city is trampled, but the temple is measured. And in prophetic literature, measuring signifies preservation, ownership, or divine protection.
I agree with that.
But here is the massive problem for your view. The temple is the very location of the abomination of desolation. If the beast, the hostile CEO in your analogy, sets up his idol in the holy place at the exact start of those 42 months, then the temple stands desecrated for the entire trampling period.
Ah, I see where you're going.
Right. It is not protected. It is the absolute epicenter of the defilement. The day 1290 placement elegantly solves this contradiction. The city is trampled for 1260 days, and only after the beast's sanctioned reign expires does he illegally intrude into the previously protected temple.
I see the tension you're highlighting. But let's pause here, because I think we need to carefully define what protection actually means in this apocalyptic context.
Okay?
You are assuming measuring equates to a physical, almost magical barrier preventing the beast's idol from entering the sanctuary, but measuring the temple often signifies God's ultimate theological ownership or the spiritual preservation of a remnant of true worshipers. It doesn't guarantee the physical masonry is immune to defilement.
But why explicitly separate it from the outer court, which is physically trampled?
Because the spiritual core of God's people remains His, even while the physical infrastructure is overrun. Furthermore, look at Paul's words in 2 Thessalonians 2. He says the man of lawlessness must take his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God.
Yes, the temple intrusion.
Right. That isn't just a brief flash-in-the-pan moment of vandalism. That indicates systemic legislated worship. It perfectly fits an extended 3.5-year desecration where the beast operates a rival religious system out of the temple itself, just as Antiochus Epiphanes did for an extended period.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The problem with reading 2 Thessalonians 2 as a 3.5-year administrative religious system is that it fundamentally misunderstands the theological purpose of the temple intrusion. And this gets to the stakes of our whole debate today.
Go ahead.
During his sanctioned 42-month reign, the beast's authority is functionally global. Revelation 13 says he exercises political and economic domination through the mark of the beast. He controls who can buy and sell on a planetary scale. He doesn't need to sit in a physical building in Jerusalem to consolidate administrative control. He already has it.
Then what is the purpose of the temple intrusion in your model, if not administrative control?
It serves an entirely different purpose. It is the climactic theological act of self-deification out of sheer panic. By delaying the abomination until day 1290, after the expiration of his 42-month sanctioned reign, the event becomes his desperate climactic act of cosmic rebellion, precisely because his kingdom is beginning to collapse under divine judgment.
It's an act of panic.
Exactly. It transforms the abomination of desolation from administrative domination into open, frantic defiance.
Well, let's pull on that thread, because you're raising a fundamental claim about the nature of the Great Tribulation itself. You're arguing that the beast's actual sanctioned authority from God ends at day 1260 at the sounding of the seventh trumpet.
Correct.
But the abomination doesn't happen until day 1290. So you have this bizarre 30-day window where the beast is ruling illegally? I mean, how does a global dictator enforce the mark of the beast, mobilize armies, and institute global idol worship if he has no sanctioned authority?
Through residual power. Think of a tenant whose lease is expired. When the seventh trumpet sounds, the announcement is made in heaven. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord. The beast's lease is up. His divinely permitted reign officially expires, but a bad tenant doesn't just vanish the second the clock strikes midnight.
Oh, they barricade the door.
Yes, exactly. He still temporarily occupies the house, but as an exposed and illegitimate usurper. His continued activity during the final 75 days, which includes that 30-day interim plus the 45-day Great Tribulation, is not evidence of secure sovereignty. It is the frantic resistance of a ruler whose eviction is already underway.
I see.
And this perfectly maps onto the sequence Christ gave us in Matthew 24. Jesus gave a very specific chronological order. He said, first, you see the abomination of desolation set up in the holy place. Then you flee to the mountains. Then there will be unparalleled Great Tribulation. In the sequential model, the Great Tribulation isn't a vague 42-month era. It is a highly concentrated, literal 45-day period of terminal violence following that day 129 desecration.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Because to make your 75-day terminal dismantling phase work, you have to compress an enormous amount of apocalyptic judgment into an incredibly tiny window.
How so?
Let's look at the how and why of these judgments. In your model, all 7 bowl judgments, which are the final plagues of Revelation, happen in this 75-day period.
Yes, they are the eviction process.
But let's think about the logistics of what these bowls actually are. They include terrifying global ecological collapse. The oceans turn to blood. Every living thing in the sea dies. The sun scorches the earth with intense heat.
Right.
The Euphrates River completely dries up to prepare the way for the kings of the East. The armies of the world are gathered together at Armageddon, and ultimately the total global collapse of Babylon's economic and physical infrastructure occurs. All of that is squeezed into just 75 days. I severely question the plausibility of this intense compression.
Why is 75 days too short for God to pour out wrath?
Because human beings still have to react to it within the narrative. If you boil the ocean, scorch the planet, and plunge the beast kingdom into literal darkness in a matter of weeks, humanity wouldn't even have the time or the logistical infrastructure to organize a massive global army, then march them to Armageddon.
That's a fair logistical point.
Right? They'd all be dead or incapacitated from the ecological collapse. The midpoint view, spreading these catastrophic civilization-ending judgments over the entire 42-month period, provides a much more rational timeline for a global dismantling than a 75-day judicial cascade. It explains how the world slowly falls apart while the beast is in power.
I understand the logistical concern, I really do. But Revelation assigns no explicit duration markers to the bowl judgments. Unlike the seals and the trumpets earlier in the book, which clearly unfold across longer, drawn-out developmental stages, the bowls are event-defined.
Meaning they just happen.
Meaning they are poured out in rapid succession. Revelation 15:1 explicitly identifies the bowls as the finishing stage, the completion of divine wrath.
But that doesn't necessarily mean instantaneous.
Not instantaneous, but remarkably swift. It is entirely plausible and, honestly, theologically fitting that God acts swiftly to forcibly remove the unlawful occupant once that lease expires. The compression you are worried about isn't a bug in the sequential model. It's the defining feature.
It explains the intensity.
Yes, it explains why the beast's rage intensifies so dramatically. He isn't acting from a place of secure power over 3.5 years. He is lashing out under the concentrated, unbearable pressure of immediate, rapid-fire divine judgment.
I see the narrative appeal of the desperate, cornered dictator. It's a highly dramatic image. But we cannot abandon the structural cohesion of the traditional model just to satisfy a sequential reading of the judgments. Let's return to the math, specifically the blessing of Daniel 12:12.
Okay.
The text says, "Blessed is the one who waits and reaches the 1,335 days." In the midpoint view, the 1260 days represent the tribulation. The additional 75 days, bringing us to that 1,335 marker, represent the transition period after Christ's return to earth to set up the millennial kingdom.
Ah, the earthly administration phase.
Exactly. It beautifully accounts for the time needed for the judgments of the surviving nations described in Matthew 25. By shifting the abomination to day 1290, you push the entire timeline to the right, forcing the Great Tribulation to occur after the traditional 1260-day mark.
That's a compelling argument.
But have you considered that I absolutely pushed the timeline to the right because Daniel explicitly gives us the numbers to do so?
How so?
The traditional view uses those extra 75 days as a post-tribulation mop-up operation. You use it for setting up earthly administration. But Daniel 12 connects the 1290 days directly to the setting up of the abomination itself. It's right there in the grammar of verse 11.
Right, we debated that grammar earlier.
And the blessing of day 1335 belongs to those who survive the incredibly intense 45-day Great Tribulation that follows that desecration.
So you see the blessing as mere survival, just making it to the end?
I see it as preserving the absolute integrity of the text. Revelation pronounces a blessing on the martyrs who die refusing to worship the beast during his reign. Daniel pronounces a blessing on the survivors who physically endure that final 45-day crucible to day 1335 and actually get to see the visible glorious return of Christ. The math works perfectly without having to invent a 75-day administrative buffer zone.
Well, we have covered incredible ground here today, and I think we have clearly laid out the stakes of this timeline. It's time to pull these complex threads together.
Let's do it.
From my perspective, the traditional midpoint view remains the most structurally cohesive reading of biblical prophecy. By aligning the cessation of sacrifice and the setting up of the abomination of desolation into a single simultaneous hinge event at the exact middle of the 7 years, we honor the historical prototype of Antiochus Epiphanes.
It definitely maintains that historical symmetry.
It seamlessly integrates Daniel 9's 70th week with the 42-month reign of the beast in Revelation 13. It creates a single, elegant theological framework where the entire second half of the week is defined by the beast's absolute desecration and rule. And practically speaking, it provides a rational, logistically sound timeline for the outpouring of God's final judgments, allowing the narrative to breathe rather than crushing global ecological collapse into an impossibly tight 75-day window.
And my summary is that while symmetry is nice, simplicity should never override textual precision. The sequential nested 1290 model honors the absolute mathematical and grammatical accuracy of Daniel 12.
By separating the events.
Right. It respects the text when it explicitly separates the stopping of sacrifice from the setting up of the abomination. It successfully resolves the glaring contradiction in Revelation 11 by allowing Jerusalem to be trampled while the temple remains temporarily protected from the beast's physical presence.
The eviction phase.
Exactly. And most importantly, it perfectly maps the strict sequential logic Christ laid out in Matthew 24. The abomination of desolation is not necessarily a midpoint event. It is a delayed, terminal act of theological rebellion, an expired tenant barricading the door that launches a terrifyingly brief 45-day Great Tribulation.
Despite our distinct frameworks and the different ways we calculate these profound days, there are deep areas of convergence here. We both unequivocally agree on what the abomination of desolation actually is. It is the ultimate act of cosmic rebellion.
Completely agreed.
It is the absolute focal point that triggers unparalleled global distress. Whether it happens at the 1260-day mark out of supreme arrogance or the 1290-day mark out of desperate panic, it represents humanity's darkest usurpation of God's glory.
Beautifully said. Our continued disagreement really hinges on how we read the underlying machinery of prophetic literature. Does it require reading events as simultaneous fulfillment to achieve structural harmony, as you suggest, or does it demand strict sequential event counting that delays the fulfillment, as I argue?
That really is the crux of it. Examining these contrasting models reveals just how astonishingly complex the structural architecture of Daniel and Revelation truly is. It forces us to slow down, define our terms, and stop taking traditional assumptions for granted.
It forces us back to the text.
Yes. We encourage you to return to the source texts with both of these frameworks in mind. Look at the data yourself to see which synthesis best honors the biblical text.
The evidence is all there, waiting to be measured.
Just remember, sometimes when you are staring at an eclipse, what looks like a single simultaneous moment of totality is actually the precise, inevitable machinery of sequencing moving in the dark.